She ended up walking away from $55,000 just because they never really could understand her vision. No development had even started.
Welcome back to another episode of The Leader Within. Today, I'm excited to introduce Paisley Churchill, a consultant and serial entrepreneur. Paisley has worked with hundreds of companies, from startups to established businesses, helping them bring their software visions to life. With experience in economic development, supporting a $100 million fund, and launching over 30 custom software projects, she has seen firsthand how costly mistakes happen when founders don't know what they don't know. So drawing on her extensive experience on custom software development, consulting, and entrepreneurship, Paisley founded The Tech Translator, where she empowers non-technical founders and business leaders. And that is why I'm excited to have her share her insights with you. Well, welcome, Paisley. You've worked with hundreds of companies. Can you share with us a story or a tipping point that inspired you to focus on empowering non-technical founders and business leaders?
Yeah, thanks, Angela, for having me. So I was working in custom software, and I continued to see this problem over and over again. But it really hit home when I joined Team CarePal, which is a startup that's trying to change the game for the way that family caregivers work, try to support their loved ones going through illness, injury, or disability. And so I joined this amazing founder, Cindy Sim, and saw firsthand the struggles that she went through as a non-technical founder. So originally she was with a company and they just didn't quite get her vision. She ended up walking away from $55,000 just because they never really could understand her vision. And so it made sense to part ways at this point. No development had even started. This was really the planning and the mock-up phase that we just couldn't quite get it over the line. So at that point, it just made sense to find a new company. And so I saw firsthand her go through that struggle. And then again, as we were going through the software process with the new app development company, I continued to see these little misunderstandings that were based on her not knowing the right questions to ask or not having some of the terms and understanding of how software works. So after going through that with her, plus doing a bunch of consulting projects, I really saw this gap. And so I wanted to create a framework for non-technical founders to really understand how to go through this process.
I appreciate you sharing that story. And I'm curious, what have you noticed is that the number one mistakes that founders make during this process of selecting their software development team or maybe communicating their vision?
Yeah, I think it's this misunderstanding, thinking that they're not technical, so they need to defer everything to their software team. When in actuality, software is much more about how you want something to work than what is possible. So if you're saying, I want to build a news feed out, and somebody says, okay, do you want, let's say, a pop-up when you go to delete a post? Do you want a pop-up to say, are you sure you want to delete it? And they'll say, oh, I don't know. You're the technical person, but that's not really a technical question. But they really just tend to defer everything to their tech team. And then what's built is not what their customer needs because, these were a series of business questions, not technical questions that they were being asked. So I think the number one mistake is that they underestimate the level of involvement that they need to have because they think they're not technical.
Gotcha. And I noticed that communication breakdowns often happen between technical and non-technical folks, just based on my experience, like working in different environments. And if you could offer a piece of advice to help non-technical founders effectively communicate their vision to their technical teams, what advice would that be?
I think that first they need to really understand the fundamentals of software. So it's not entering this process until you understand a lot of the terms and the base concepts. Just the same way where you shouldn't be, building a house or, doing these other large investments without doing a little bit of base due diligence. It's the same with software. It doesn't mean you need to learn how to code, but you do need to understand what a front end is, what a back end is, how they interplay, how things are called from a database. Just understanding those base fundamental pieces would be my number one piece of advice, because then you're actually going to be able to communicate with them in the way that they'll understand.
And you know what? Sometimes people don't know what they don't know. So what would you recommend for non-technical founders to identify and address some of those gaps so that they can avoid some of those costly mistakes that you've noticed?
Yeah, we're living in a world where you can find out anything. So literally Googling it, asking ChatGPT what you should know, understanding the different roles that are involved, because there's 8 or 9 roles that are typical in a custom software build. So understanding all the players that go into this, even if you're only talking to one main contact on your side, understand the different roles and the things that are happening behind the scenes, understand those base concepts. And you can find all of this on Google. You can chat GPT it. You can take my course if you don't want to have to sift through everything. But the other big piece of advice is not reaching out to a custom software company first. Your first step should be deeply understanding what you want to build instead of thinking, I'm going to reach out first. Because if you reach out first, oftentimes you'll say, I want these 5 things. But what you really need to do is say, this is exactly how I want that to look. There's a difference between saying, I want a newsfeed and I want a newsfeed like Facebook. And so if you were going to kind of describe those differences, let's say, because everyone knows Facebook. So as the example, you have the ability to, you press on the like button, then something pops up. There's 5 different options. The way that it shows how many people have liked it. Is it showing 60 people have liked it? Is it showing Angela, Paisley, and 58 others? Are you able to reply to comments? What is the notification structure on that? What is the word limit? Like there's one thing to say, I want a newsfeed. And then those are some of the things that you can really do to spell it out for your app developers, because saying, I want a newsfeed, they might say, oh, okay, we can do that in 2 weeks. But then once you really start to dive deep into all those little things you want, it could be so much more. And so I think that if you just reach out without that deep understanding of what you want, that's a recipe for disaster. You're not going to get a proper quote, and it's going to lead to change orders and frustrations, and you're going to be mad at them, but it's not their fault.
Okay, speaking of change orders and all that, because sometimes you go in it with one vision, and then as you go through the different iterations of, okay, like our product's getting closer to launch, sometimes founders are like, I want this change. I want this change. So curious from your perspective, how much does that cost on average if you don't think about it's a couple thousand each time you make a change. So let's kind of actually think through it thoroughly first. So love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think what most people don't understand is how many different code bases you can have for a front end. So what a lot of people don't realize is that when you look at your Facebook app, they have a web version that would be written in a web language. They have an iOS version, they have an Android version, and then they have a backend. So those are actually 4 separate code bases. So every time you want to make a change, it's not just a quick change. Even if it's wording, even if it's changing how your sign-in page verbiage looks or an image, you're now changing that on 3 different front ends. And depending on how that change looks, you might also have to change it on the back end. So I think that's what people don't understand is it's not just a little change. It's the coordination, it's the project management, it's ensuring that these 4 different people who are, specialized in 4 different areas understand the change. There's so much more than just changing some words. That's where I see some of the biggest friction is people saying, why is me changing some wording going to cost me $1,000? And they don't see what's happening behind the curtain there, and they're just mad. And so that's why I always advocate for understanding these things up front, because once something's built incorrectly, it is going to take a lot more to change it. Because like I said, there's the overhead, there's the management, and it could be built on several different platforms.
And I'm curious if you also start with a customer in mind, because if you target from like a B2C perspective versus a B2B perspective, the amount of add-ons that you may consider, even from a security perspective, may be different too, right? So would love to hear your thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, so you absolutely should start with a customer in mind. And so in agile development, there's something called stories. So you kind of build out a story of what that exactly looks like and how you want that feature to work from that customer's perspective. And so anything outside of that is called an edge case. So if you're building for, a consumer and this is the journey that you'd like them to take, and that's the ideal journey, and you also should start thinking of things that they might do outside of that journey, which are edge cases, because you might need to account for those either in development, or you might need to put in pop-ups or something to steer them back along to that desired path. But it's really important to understand your customer so that you can really identify what that ideal path is, and also let your software team know that as well, so that they can be part of that, and we can all kind of see around the corners of what that ideal journey would look like for that customer in mind.
Speaking of that coding piece, I know there's a lot of advertisements where it's like, oh, this AI product might be no code to low code, therefore you'll be able to develop a product in no time kind of thing, right? So curious to hear your thoughts on just what the value is of actually hiring that software development team versus seeing some of these ads and being like, you know what, like I can start my own company, like we're good.
Yes. Oh my God, this is my favorite topic right now, because I've seen so many people be like, well, I'm just going to do it myself, or, you're going to be out of a job as a software developer. But even if you were to do a no-code solution, and I've tried, it's way harder than it seems, you still need to identify every single field that you would need in that database and build it out. Just because you're not actually coding it doesn't mean you still don't need to identify your user roles, your user stories, your database structure. There's still all of those pieces. There's never going to be a time where AI will be able to build something without you telling it those pieces. So you do need to have an understanding of how systems work. Like if you think of it as an Excel spreadsheet, kind of, you still need to build out where you're storing that data so that you can call on it later so that, it's still valuable. Like if you think of it as a news feed, where in your database are you storing that post that Angela just made so that Paisley can see it another time? Like all of those fundamentals are still there, whether you're doing no code or you're hiring a team. You still need to be able to tell whether it's the AI or the team how you want that to function. So all of this still remains the exact same. What it does is it makes your coding team a little bit faster. And it's kind of like WordPress, honestly. You could do your own website in WordPress. Is it worth it? Probably not. It's a lot of work. As any entrepreneur will tell you, it's cheaper to just hire somebody who actually knows how to use the platform. And it's the same with no-code solutions. So yes, it will help us get things cheaper, but you still need to empower yourself as the non-technical entrepreneur to really understand what you want.
I digress a little bit because when you mentioned that WordPress piece, as an entrepreneur, I can fully appreciate sometimes where you're like, you know what, I can just do it myself and save some money here. And then in the long run, you're like, all the hours I wasted probably could compute back to how much money I could have saved if I just paid someone to do it right the first time, right? And in an increasingly global tech landscape, how can leaders build empathy and overcome some of those cultural barriers when working with a distributed software development team?
I love this so much. And I think it goes back to really understanding the frame of reference for global teams. And it just is even more important that you say exactly what you want, because if my frame of reference for a newsfeed is Instagram, because that's the one I use the most, I usually use Facebook as an example because I think it's the most commonly used. Like everybody would have seen it. But if you're talking to, a Chinese developer or an Indian developer, their frame of reference might be WeChat or something. I have no clue what they'll use, right? So if you're saying build me a newsfeed, it's going to look different if you're just being ambiguous. They're going to use their own frame of reference. And so you need to understand where they're coming from. You need to understand their backgrounds, and you need to eliminate that ambiguity so that they can do a good job because they want to do a good job. And by just coming at things and being ambiguous and assuming the other person has the same frame of reference as you, that's obviously not going to happen, especially because so many amazing software developers are not, English first language or from Canada. Like we're seeing some of the top talent is international.
And based on your experience vetting software development teams, what would you say is one of the hardest learning lessons that you've had to learn from recruiting that team?
It's that the salesperson is not the person building your product. You can get along amazingly with a salesperson. You should. That's their job. They're supposed to be, getting you through the door. But you also need to meet the people who are actually doing the work. You need to talk to their references. You need to understand actually what's going on behind the door and not get swayed by a really good salesperson. Because, like I said, they're going to hand you off. They're not the person you're working with. And you'll probably never even talk to them again past that initial phase. So don't get swayed by an awesome salesperson. Make sure you're talking to the real people doing the work.
And have you encountered any situations where you're like, oh, well, that was a huge red flag that I kind of overlooked when hiring that software developer. And then later in hindsight, you're like, okay, now I know to pay attention in the future. If they overpromise in a certain area or the way that they come across, this is what I'm going to look out for more.
Yes, I have seen that. But I think the most important thing is to just build those promises into your contracts. And it's hard to pick out one or two things. It's just obviously if it feels too good to be true, it probably is. And that's why it's important to get a few different quotes and ensure that things are kind of aligned. And if somebody is coming in a lot lower than the others, it's, is their understanding the same as the others? Are they making assumptions? Like what's included? It could be a recipe for a lot of change orders if they've under-scoped it, right? So I think it's important that if you are getting these promises, you're writing all of that into your contract. And there's clear repercussions. And if they're hesitant to sign that, then they're not your guys. Like if they're this confident that they can do it when they're talking to you, but refuse to put it in the contract, that's an issue. So I always advocate for people putting in, code spot checks by a third party. How do I know it's even written in the language you said it was? I, as a non-technical person, wouldn't be able to do that. And as much as I know about software, I couldn't go poking around AWS and say, yeah, you're right. It's written in the right language you said it was. Yeah, it's built on an updated framework. So put those things in your contract, put timelines in, ensure you're structuring your payment milestones based on when you're actually getting something. There's a lot of ways to protect yourself.
Really good call on putting it in writing. And I think it's sometimes difficult for some of us who trust easily. We're like, oh, well, if they say they could, maybe we don't need to. But honestly, it's for when it goes bad, not when it's good. And looking ahead, what would you say are maybe 1 to 3 skills that will be crucial for non-technical founders to develop in order to successfully lead tech-driven companies?
Ooh, that's a really good question. I think it's understanding how software is structured is the first one. Understanding user roles and APIs and the frameworks there. I also think communication is a really important thing, and product management fundamentals, understanding your customer, being able to explain that to your dev teams. So there's so much around product management and how you kind of take that outside information and translate it to your team. And then the third thing is, I would say it doesn't hurt to do a little, like to understand a little bit of the tech yourself. So, play around with a no-code solution, understand how the database works and how you do this, and just understand the complexities around it. I think those are 3 things that you could absolutely do to better equip yourself.
I appreciate the insights that you shared in bridging that gap between non-technical founders and technical teams. And now I want to focus a little bit on your entrepreneurial story. Like I said, you're a serial entrepreneur and you've also worked with so many different companies. What would you say is the number 1 lesson you've learned to date based on your journey?
There's so many. I would say trust people until they give you a reason not to. And, I love failing forward and I love trying to bring people in and seeing the best in people, and always giving people a chance with a small project up front. If there's a way to dip your toes in the water to see kind of doing something small together first before you enter into a big relationship, that's absolutely what I would do, because that gives you the flexibility to explore everyone's talents and see how it works without, I always hear the story or the phrase, hire slow, fire fast. But I'm kind of the opposite, where I'm hire quick, fire fast. Like, I want to do both fast. Like, I like you. Let's work together. Let's try it out. Let's do a little project. So if you could do that with a software developer or a graphic designer or whatever that skill is, and there's a little project that you can try together before moving forward, I think that's awesome, because you can spend months and months vetting the perfect candidate and it still couldn't work out. So, I just like being agile like that.
I wanted to give you a huge kudos with your ability to fail forward and just how you develop those relationships and have developed your businesses. Like, I don't know how you do it, but you are doing an amazing job there. And as you all know, being an entrepreneur or a leader, time is of the essence. And if you can have any productivity tools, you definitely want to leverage it. So for you, do you have some favorite tools right now that help you with your workflows that you want to be able to share?
Ooh, that's a good one too. I am severely ADHD, and I think anyone that's talked to me for more than 5 minutes would pick up on that. I really lean into doing what works for me and not trying to kind of adhere to what the typical workflows are or what society wants. So for me, I like to take meetings during the day, and then I do my deep thinking work at night. I work when I'm most productive, and my clients all know that. My people I work with all know that. And it's not trying to do everything when I'm not productive, just to fit their schedules. And I always get everything done, but it's just on my schedules. I think that's the most important thing. I also love time blocking. I wish I had a magic solution, like a software that I could recommend. But really, I think it's the blocking your time, building it in deliverables to yourself, or scheduling touch bases with my clients to keep myself on track. It's those types of things. I don't actually have a software right now that's doing any of that for me.
All good. And I think Adam Grant actually has a book called When that talks about some of the things that you mentioned, right? Like understanding when you are most productive and then building your work around it where possible. We understand sometimes clients don't always operate against that, but wherever you can, like that's a great method. And as we slowly wrap up our conversation, what do you think it takes to unleash the potential of individuals and organizations?
Oh, I love this so much. Okay, so the first thing is, one, we have to acknowledge privilege, and we need to do what we can to allow people that don't feel the privilege of being themselves to be themselves. I recently wrote a little blog about this. It's one thing to get to say, I am unapologetically myself in the workforce. But that comes with so much privilege. I don't have kids. I don't, have anyone really relying on me. I'm married. So if worse comes to worse, I do have, somebody to pick up some of that slack. That allows me this huge amount of privilege to work the way I want to and not have to adhere to exactly how, the typical success looks. And it's worked for me, but would I be able to take those risks if I was at risk of losing my house or not being able to feed my children, or if I'm an immigrant without a large network and another job to go to? So I think it's so important that we do unlock that. But first, we need to examine the privilege that it takes to actually make that work. So as leaders, we can kind of examine and say, this person might not feel empowered. They might feel like they can lose their job if they're, not towing the line. And so understanding how you can make that a part of your workplace culture. And that's where tenure, I know it's kind of controversial, but that's literally why tenure was built into universities, because it gives people the ability to say what they want and look at the things that they want to do and express themselves. And so how do we build that into organizations is so important. It's like when you have that privilege and you have that security, but we need to be able to make everybody feel secure so they're able to take risks and they're not fearing like they'll lose their jobs.
You know what? I appreciate that call out on privilege, right? Because I think when we have the confidence to look ourselves in the mirrors and assess that piece, I believe it allows us to build empathy and better meet individuals where they're at and then build from there. And my last question to you is, what is one thing that is top of mind for you right now in terms of if someone in the audience were to reach out?
I love meeting new people. I'm always happy to have an online chat. And, it's always nice when you're cold reaching out if you have a real ask, like, do you want to learn more about tech? Do you have a software project that you're struggling with? Do you just want to chat? Like it's kind of helpful to kind of know what they want. So love to chat with everybody. And yeah, feel free to message me on LinkedIn.
Awesome. Well, Paisley, thank you so much for taking the time to share your story and your insights. I really appreciate it so that other non-technical founders can avoid some of the costly mistakes that you've noticed. And a quick plug for your course. If anyone wants to actually expedite their learning journey, might as well learn from someone who's been through it. And to everyone else that's tuned into another episode, thank you so much for your time and attention. It means more to me than you'll know, and I can't wait to stay in touch with you on my next episode. Till then, stay safe.